The room went silent in a way that felt unnatural, as if even the air itself had decided to hold its breath. Only moments earlier, soft laughter had drifted across the studio, the comfortable sound of an audience enjoying familiar conversation. Now that warmth had vanished, replaced by a stillness so heavy it seemed to press gently against every chest in the room. Cameras continued to roll, their quiet mechanical hum suddenly noticeable. Studio lights glowed overhead, warm but restrained, illuminating a stage that no longer felt like a place of entertainment, but like a space where something human was about to unfold. Keanu Reeves sat upright in his chair, hands loosely folded in his lap, shoulders relaxed yet composed. His expression was calm but not empty. It was the kind of calm that comes not from ease but from long practice. The kind learned by someone who has spent years enduring rather than reacting, listening rather than explaining, carrying more than he ever allowed himself to show. Across from him, angled slightly away, Sandra Bullock listened as the host finished a question that everyone in the room already understood without needing to hear the words. It wasn't about a movie. It wasn't about awards, box offices, or nostalgia. It was about something unfinished, something time had not erased, only layered over, something that had lived quietly between two people while the world watched them from a distance, assuming, interpreting, projecting. When the host finally paused, the silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable, and in that space the audience felt it. This was not a segment. This was not performance. This was a moment that had been waiting years to exist. Keanu did not look at Sandra right away. His eyes lowered briefly as if he were searching for something on the floor that had been lost long ago, something small, something fragile, something that had slipped through his fingers at a time when he hadn't realized how much it mattered. People often mistook his quiet for mystery, his restraint for detachment, but those who truly knew him understood that silence was not absence. It was weight. It was care. It was the habit of someone who had learned early that words, once released, could not be gathered back, and that some truths, if spoken without care, could wound more deeply than any lie. He had built a life around gentleness, around presence without intrusion, kindness without spectacle. Yet beneath that gentleness lived memories that had never been fully named. The host cleared his throat softly, sensing the gravity of what had been stirred. He began to speak, perhaps to redirect, perhaps to protect the rhythm of the show. But before he could, Keanu raised a hand, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to signal that he wanted to speak. The gesture alone sent a ripple through the room. This was not a man who interrupted lightly. When he chose to speak, it was because he believed something mattered more than comfort, more than timing, more than control. "It's okay," he said quietly, his voice steady, but layered with something unspoken. I think this is something that's been waiting a long time." The audience leaned forward without realizing they had. The cameras adjusted subtly. Sandra exhaled slowly, as if bracing herself for a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to hear but had always known she would one day need. Keanu didn't begin with explanation. He didn't reach for humor. He didn't soften the moment with nostalgia. Instead, he spoke about time, about how it has a way of convincing people that silence is the same as peace, that moving on means understanding. When in reality, it often means postponing the harder conversations. He spoke about kindness, not as something public, not as a reputation, but as a private responsibility. Something owed most deeply to the people we care about, something that sometimes demands discomfort. As he spoke, it became clear that this wasn't only about Sandra. It wasn't even only about the past. It was about regret. About the moments when good people choose distance instead of honesty because honesty feels too dangerous in the moment, because it risks misunderstanding, because it requires vulnerability. He talked about how easy it is to believe that stepping back is respectful, that leaving things unspoken protects everyone involved. And how slowly, almost invisibly, that belief can turn into something else. Confusion, self-doubt, quiet harm with no clear source. Sandra listened without interrupting, her eyes never leaving his face. To the audience, she appeared composed, dignified, the same woman they had admired for decades. But inside, memories stirred, late-night conversations, laughter that felt effortless, the rare comfort of being fully herself without performance. Back then, she had believed that if something mattered enough, it would survive without explanation. She had believed that mutual respect would bridge whatever words didn't. What she hadn't known was that Keanu, despite his steadiness, carried his own quiet storms, that his instinct to protect often took the shape of retreat, that what felt like distance to her had felt like responsibility to him. The host faded into the background as the exchange took on a life of its own. Keanu spoke about how time amplifies misunderstandings, how assumptions grow louder when the truth remains unspoken. He acknowledged that there were moments when he should have been braver, when he should have trusted that honesty would not destroy what they had but might have deepened it. The audience felt the weight of those words because they recognized them, not as celebrity confession, but as something painfully human. Everyone had someone they never fully explained themselves to, someone who deserved clarity and instead received silence. When Sandra finally spoke, her voice was calm but unmistakably emotional, carrying years of restraint in every carefully chosen word. She didn't accuse him, she didn't dramatize the past. Instead, she spoke about waiting, not longing, not hoping, but the quiet way people wait for understanding that may never come. She admitted that for a long time she had questioned herself, wondered if she had missed something, said something wrong, expected too much. And in speaking it aloud, she gave voice to something millions of people feel but rarely name: the uncertainty that grows not from rejection, but from not knowing. In that moment, the story shifted. This was no longer about two famous people revisiting a shared history. It became a story about accountability, about how even kind people can hurt each other unintentionally, about how respect sometimes means choosing discomfort over avoidance. Offstage, watching quietly, Alexandra Grant observed with thoughtful intensity. She was not there as an outsider, not as a rival, but as someone who knew Keanu in the present, who understood how much of him had been shaped by unspoken grief and lifelong restraint. She had always believed that healing was not about erasing the past, but about honoring it honestly. She did not feel threatened by the moment unfolding. She recognized it as necessary. Some conversations, she knew, don't reopen wounds. They finally allow them to close. As the segment drew toward its end, the host gently re-entered, thanking both of them. But something irreversible had already happened. The audience rose in applause, not loud, not excited, but full. The kind born of recognition. This wasn't spectacle. This was vulnerability. Keanu turned once more to Sandra, his expression softer now, freer, as if something long carried had finally shifted. "I'm grateful," he said quietly, "that we're having this conversation now." Sandra nodded, a small, genuine smile breaking through, not the smile of performance, the smile of relief. Yet this was only the beginning. Because outside the studio lights, beyond applause and headlines, deeper conversations were still waiting. Conversations that could not happen on a stage. Conversations about forgiveness, about growth, about the ways people evolve without losing who they once were. The world would frame this moment in countless ways, some shallow, some dramatic, some incomplete, but the truth was simpler and more powerful. Two people chose honesty over comfort, respect over avoidance. And in doing so, reminded everyone watching that courage is not always loud. Sometimes it looks like finally facing someone after all these years, and choosing to speak, not for the cameras, but for the soul. The applause faded, the lights dimmed, the audience slowly filtered out, but the weight of what had happened did not leave with them. Keanu walked down the narrow corridor behind the stage with the same quiet composure he always carried. Yet inside him, something had shifted, unsettled, exposed. For the first time in years, he understood that silence had never been peace, only postponement. Each step echoed with memories he thought time had softened. And for the first time, he recognized that moving forward sometimes requires turning back and standing still long enough to face what was avoided. Sandra remained in her dressing room long after her assistant gently suggested it was time to leave. She stared at her reflection, not searching for flaws, but for traces of the woman she had been then. Hearing Keanu speak had stirred emotions she had neatly organized and stored away. The public moment had been dignified, but the private impact was far deeper. There were things she had wanted to ask years ago, words she had never given space. Now they pressed gently against her chest, asking not for drama, but for acknowledgement. Outside, media voices were already forming narratives, but none of them captured the truth. What had unfolded was not a resolution. It was an opening, and both of them knew it. Something had finally begun. The hours that followed the broadcast moved strangely for Keanu Reeves, not fast, not slow, but with a density that made every moment feel heavier than it should have. The car ride away from the studio passed in near silence, city lights sliding across the windows like distant, indifferent witnesses to a shift that no headline could fully capture. He sat in the back seat with his hands loosely folded, posture unchanged, yet internally everything felt unsettled, as if a room he had kept carefully locked for years had finally been opened, allowing air to move through spaces long sealed. The applause still echoed faintly in his ears, not as praise, but as a reminder that something deeply personal had unfolded in public. What surprised him was not the vulnerability of the moment, but the unexpected calm that followed it. He had always believed that revisiting the past would reopen wounds. Instead, it had illuminated them, and in doing so, softened their edges. For the first time in years, he did not feel as though he were carrying something unnamed. He felt as though he had finally placed it on the table. Back at his home, the familiar quiet did not comfort him the way it usually did. It was no longer an escape. It was an invitation. He moved through the room slowly, the soft sounds of evening settling in around him, the distant hum of traffic, the subtle creak of the floor beneath his steps. He made tea, though he barely drank it, standing instead near the window as steam rose and disappeared, thinking about how many things in life vanish without explanation. His thoughts returned again and again to Sandra, not as the public figure the world adored, but as the person he had known in moments unseen. The laughter that had surprised him, the seriousness she carried beneath humor, the steadiness that had once made him feel safe and paradoxically unworthy of burdening. He recognized now how deeply that belief had shaped his choices. He had convinced himself that restraint was kindness, that absence was respect. That by stepping back, he was sparing her something she should never have had to carry. What he had not allowed himself to see was that by removing himself, he had left her alone with questions only he could answer. Meanwhile, Sandra Bullock's evening unfolded in a different, but no less reflective, quiet. She had returned home with a composed smile, thanked those around her, answered messages that carried excitement and curiosity, and only when the door finally closed behind her did she allow herself to exhale fully. The house felt still in a way that made sound unnecessary. She set her things aside without attention, moving on instinct rather than thought until she found herself sitting alone, hands resting in her lap, eyes unfocused. The studio lights had been bright, the audience attentive, the exchange dignified, yet beneath that surface something tender had been stirred. Hearing Keanu speak had not only given her clarity, it had given her language for something she had carried quietly for years. The uncertainty, the wondering, the subtle erosion of trust in her own perception. She had not lived in pain, but neither had she lived in full understanding. The absence of explanation had never screamed. It had whispered. It had appeared in moments when she questioned whether she had imagined the closeness they once shared, whether she had misread sincerity as something deeper, whether the quiet ending reflected something lacking in her. And now, in a matter of minutes, that whisper had finally been answered. She stood and moved slowly through her living room, fingers brushing the edge of furniture as if grounding herself in the present. She thought about the way Keanu's voice had remained steady even as he acknowledged his fear. How he had not spoken as someone defending himself, but as someone accepting responsibility for the impact of his choices. That distinction mattered to her more than any apology could have. It told her that what they were touching was not about fault. It was about honesty. It was about recognizing that even gentle people can cause harm when they choose silence over clarity. And as she sat there, the truth settled into her chest with a strange combination of sadness and relief. The past had not been wrong. It had been incomplete. And incompleteness, she realized, has a way of shaping narratives in the absence of truth. Days passed, not dramatically, not marked by spectacle, but filled with a thoughtful quiet that lingered in both their lives. Keanu found himself more attentive to moments he had once allowed to drift. He listened differently. He noticed when he hesitated before speaking and asked himself why. He paid attention to the small instinct to retreat that had guided him for so long, and for the first time he questioned it rather than obeying it. Alexandra Grant, present in his life with her usual warmth and steadiness, observed these subtle shifts without needing them explained. She had known him long enough to recognize when something internal was reordering itself. She did not press him for details. She did not frame the broadcast as an event to analyze. Instead, she offered what she always had: space, support, and a quiet confidence that facing the past did not threaten the present. In her presence, Keanu felt permission not only to remember, but to respond differently to what memory asked of him. It was on the third evening after the show that he sat at his desk long after night had settled fully around him. The room was softly lit, shadows stretching across shelves and walls, the world outside reduced to distant, muted motion. He had tried to read. He had tried to listen to music. He had tried to let the moment pass, but something within him refused to be set aside. He took out a sheet of paper, not with a plan, not with rehearsed words, but with an acceptance that something needed to be written. He had spent years speaking carefully, often choosing what not to say. Now he allowed himself to begin without knowing where he would end. The pen moved slowly at first, then with greater certainty forming lines that reflected the way he had always communicated best, deliberately, thoughtfully leaving space between sentences as if respecting the weight they carried. He did not begin with regret framed as self-judgment. He began with acknowledgement. He wrote about distance, about how he had believed he was protecting something by stepping away. He wrote about how he had not understood that respect without clarity could feel indistinguishable from indifference. He admitted that he had assumed his intentions were enough. That because he held no resentment, no bitterness, no hidden anger, silence could not possibly injure. And then he wrote the words that mattered most, the ones he had never allowed himself to say directly. He wrote that he saw now how his absence had placed the burden of interpretation on her, that he had denied her the dignity of understanding, that he had mistaken restraint for responsibility. He did not excuse. He did not dramatize. He simply named what had been. When he finished, he read the letter once, not searching for perfection, but for honesty. Then he folded it carefully, as he did everything that mattered, and arranged for it to be delivered without announcement, without public framing, without any gesture that would turn something personal into something consumable. He did not expect an immediate response. He did not expect resolution. He believed only that some words are owed regardless of outcome. Sandra received the letter in the quiet of a morning that had otherwise promised nothing remarkable. It was handed to her without explanation, placed among other mail that carried the usual rhythms of life. But she recognized the handwriting immediately. There was a particular way Keanu shaped his letters, a carefulness that reflected the way he approached conversation. She did not open it right away. She set it aside, made coffee, moved through small routines, allowing herself time before stepping into something she knew would matter. When she finally unfolded the paper, she did so slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of respect. As she read, something inside her loosened, not suddenly, not dramatically, but in the way tension eases when a long-held question finally receives an answer. His words did not erase the past. They reframed it. They took what had once felt ambiguous and placed it gently into context. She saw in his handwriting not a man retreating from responsibility, but one finally stepping into it. She felt validation without triumph, understanding without erasure. The letter did not promise anything. It did not ask for anything, and in that restraint it gave her something she had not realized she had been missing. It gave her the truth without agenda. She did not respond immediately. She carried the letter with her throughout the day, not physically but internally, returning to its lines in moments of quiet. She noticed how differently she breathed when she thought about the past now, how the old questions no longer carried the same sharpness. That evening she sat at her own desk, the house hushed around her, and took out paper of her own. She did not write as someone seeking closure. She wrote as someone offering perspective. She spoke of growth, of how time had shaped her, not by hardening her, but by teaching her discernment. She wrote of how she had learned that strength often hides vulnerability so well that others forget to ask if it needs care. She admitted that his absence had made her question herself, but she also acknowledged that it had taught her resilience, self-trust, and independence in ways she did not regret. She made it clear that she did not carry resentment. But she also did not diminish the impact of what had been left unsaid. She honored both truths, refusing to sacrifice honesty for harmony. The exchange of letters became a quiet bridge between two people no longer bound by expectation but connected by mutual respect. They did not write often. They did not write lightly. Each message was deliberate, thoughtful, free from performance. In those pages, the past was neither romanticized nor condemned. It was examined. It was named. And in being named, it lost its power to quietly distort the present. As these private conversations unfolded, both Keanu and Sandra became acutely aware of how easily the world misinterprets silence. Outside their correspondence, speculation continued, narratives crafted by people who did not live inside the spaces that matter most. But the truth did not require defense. It lived in their clarity. It lived in the way both of them felt less burdened, less guarded, less shaped by something unresolved. Keanu reflected often on how many times in life he had mistaken quiet endurance for wisdom, how many moments he had let pass because speaking felt riskier than staying still. He began to understand that authenticity, even when uncomfortable, is not an act of self-exposure alone. It is a form of service. It offers others the dignity of understanding. It allows relationships to exist in reality rather than assumption. Sandra, too, noticed changes in herself. She found that she spoke more directly, asked more openly, clarified rather than absorbed. The letter had not given her answers only about him. It had reminded her of the importance of giving herself permission to seek clarity rather than privately negotiate uncertainty. She no longer viewed that chapter of her life as a question mark. She saw it as a meaningful experience shaped by two people doing the best they could with the understanding they had at the time. That shift alone altered how she carried herself, not outwardly, but inwardly, where it mattered most. By the time they agreed, quietly and without announcement, to meet in person away from any cameras, both of them understood that whatever came next would not rewrite history, but it could redefine its meaning. This second chapter of their story did not offer resolution. It deepened the journey. It revealed that justice is not always loud. It does not always arrive in the form of dramatic reversals or public moments. Sometimes justice looks like giving someone the truth they were denied, even years later. And in that truth, allowing both people to move forward without carrying each other's unanswered questions. The quiet meeting they agreed to did not arrive with anticipation so much as with a steady gravity that grew heavier the closer it came, not because either feared confrontation, but because both understood how rare it was to revisit the past with clarity rather than accusation. In the days leading up to it, Keanu Reeves found himself reflecting on how much of his life had been shaped by patience, by waiting rather than pressing, by observing rather than asserting, and how that same instinct, once so useful, had also become the place where he hid when emotion demanded more than endurance. He recognized now that some forms of restraint are not wisdom but avoidance disguised as virtue, and that the courage he had always admired in others was something he had often withheld from himself. The letter exchange had steadied him, had removed the urgency of the moment, but it had not removed its importance. There were things still unsaid that did not belong on paper. There were expressions that required presence. And so, when the day arrived, he did not approach it as a reckoning, but as an opportunity to complete a conversation interrupted by time and misunderstanding. He chose a small cafe tucked away from the louder streets, a place that did not invite attention, where people came not to be seen but to sit with their thoughts. It had windows large enough to let the afternoon light spill softly across wooden tables worn smooth by years of quiet use, and a kind of stillness that did not feel empty but attentive. He arrived early, as he always did, not out of nervousness, but out of respect. He took a seat near the window, resting his hands around a cup he did not yet drink, and allowed himself to simply be there. In that waiting, he noticed how differently his body felt than it had before the broadcast, as though something internal had shifted from tension into readiness. He was not rehearsing what he would say. He had learned through the letters that what mattered most was not articulation, but honesty. Sandra Bullock entered without hesitation, her presence calm and unguarded, carrying the quiet assurance of someone who had made peace with not controlling outcomes. When their eyes met, there was no awkwardness, no careful choreography of greeting. Time had stripped away the illusions that once complicated their interactions, leaving behind two people capable of seeing each other clearly without performance or projection. They greeted one another warmly, not as co-stars or symbols of a shared era, but as individuals who had once mattered deeply in each other's lives and still respected that fact. They ordered simply, almost absent-mindedly, and when they settled into conversation, it was without the small talk that often fills space when people are unsure where to begin. They both understood why they were there. Keanu spoke first, not because he felt obligated, but because he recognized that clarity was his responsibility. He did not begin with the moment things ended, but with the years before, with the parts of himself he had rarely spoken about even to those closest to him. He talked about loss, not as an event, but as a condition he had learned to live inside. He explained how grief had shaped his instincts long before their paths crossed, teaching him that attachment carried risk, that closeness invited a depth of feeling he did not always trust himself to carry without harming others. He described how, during the time they had been closest, he had felt the contradiction of wanting connection while believing he had no right to bring his inner weight into someone else's life. He admitted that he had mistaken endurance for strength, withdrawal for humility, and silence for protection. As he spoke, his voice remained even, but the vulnerability beneath it was unmistakable. This was not confession as performance. It was context. It was the inner landscape that had guided decisions he once believed were thoughtful and now understood had been incomplete. Sandra listened without interrupting, not as someone collecting statements, but as someone absorbing meaning. She heard not only what he said, but what had shaped the way he said it. When he finished, she did not respond immediately. She allowed the space to exist, the way one does when something deserves to settle before being met. Then she spoke not to counter, but to place her own truth alongside his. She described how his absence had not devastated her, but had quietly destabilized her confidence in her own perception. She spoke of how she had questioned not his character, but her interpretation of what they had shared. She explained how uncertainty, when prolonged, becomes internalized, how it moves from being a question about someone else into a question about oneself. She acknowledged that her independence, so often celebrated, had sometimes made others assume she did not need reassurance or clarity, when in truth, she had simply learned how to carry unanswered things without complaint. She told him that what had lingered was not heartbreak, but the sense of a story that had ended mid-sentence. As they spoke, something subtle but profound unfolded between them. The past did not reassert itself as emotion. It revealed itself as understanding. They began to recognize how easily good intentions can miss each other when unaccompanied by communication. How respect, when left unspoken, can be indistinguishable from distance. How kindness without courage can quietly wound. They talked not only about themselves, but about the broader pattern they now saw in so many lives, how people are taught to endure, to be composed, to avoid discomfort, but not always taught how to name what matters while there is still time to do so gently. In that shared reflection, the moral center of their story emerged clearly. True humility, they agreed, is not disappearing from difficult conversations. True resilience is not carrying confusion in silence. Both require the courage to speak, while outcomes are still uncertain. Keanu found himself saying things he had never allowed himself to articulate before, not because he had lacked language, but because he had lacked permission. He spoke about how often he had believed that his role was to accommodate rather than to participate, to minimize rather than to express. He admitted that facing Sandra now had revealed how that posture, while protective in appearance, had limited his relationships by keeping them asymmetrical, allowing others to feel while he observed, allowing others to interpret while he remained undefined. Sandra responded not with judgment, but with recognition, sharing how often she had encountered the opposite expectation, to be emotionally available, expressive, reassuring, while quietly managing her own unanswered questions. In that contrast, they saw how differently shaped habits can still meet in misunderstanding, each person believing they are acting in care, while both are experiencing absence. Time moved gently around them. Cups were refilled. Light shifted across the cafe floor. Other conversations rose and fell unnoticed. What mattered remained contained within the space they had made for honesty. They did not revisit every memory. They did not analyze every moment. They allowed the essence to speak. They named what had been. They named what they had not known. And in naming it, they transformed it from something that lived in speculation into something that lived in truth. When the conversation eventually softened toward its close, there was no dramatic resolution, no definitive declaration of what the future held. There was something quieter and more durable. Mutual respect, renewed not as sentiment but as understanding. They parted not with promises but with completion. For the first time, the story they shared no longer existed as a rumor or an unresolved narrative. It existed as a lesson, one about timing, one about courage. One about the importance of giving people clarity rather than assumptions. In the days that followed, the world continued its noise, its interpretations, its appetite for meaning framed as spectacle. Yet Keanu and Sandra moved within their own lives with a steadiness untouched by that external motion. Keanu found that something fundamental had shifted in how he approached connection. He noticed when he felt the instinct to withdraw and gently challenged it. He allowed himself to speak sooner, not impulsively, but honestly. He recognized that accountability is not something demanded by others, but something chosen, and that choosing it had not diminished him. It had made him lighter. Sandra, too, experienced a recalibration. She trusted her perceptions more fully, no longer revisiting that chapter with uncertainty. The clarity she had gained did not rewrite her past. It restored her confidence in how she had lived it. Alexandra Grant's presence continued to be a quiet but essential part of this chapter, not as someone positioned against the past, but as someone who had made this honesty possible. Her understanding that healing strengthens rather than threatens relationships gave Keanu the foundation from which he could face something unresolved without fear of destabilizing what he had built. In that way, she represented the evolution that made this meeting meaningful. Growth does not ask us to deny what shaped us. It asks us to integrate it with integrity. This third chapter did not change what had happened. It changed what it meant. What once felt like a story of missed chances became a testament to personal evolution. Both Keanu and Sandra emerged from it with a deeper appreciation for the power of communication, recognizing that the greatest kindness we can offer one another is the truth delivered with care. And as they continued forward, separately but changed, the lesson of their shared journey remained quietly present. Silence may feel safe, but understanding is what heals. Time did what it often does after truth has been spoken. It did not rush forward dramatically, nor did it stall in the way it sometimes does when people are still negotiating what something means. Instead, it slowed in texture rather than in pace. Moments began to feel fuller, more deliberate, less crowded by what had once gone unaddressed. In the weeks following their private meeting, Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock returned to their respective lives, schedules, commitments, and responsibilities, yet neither returned unchanged. Something essential had settled into place, like a long misaligned compass finally pointing true north. There were no announcements, no carefully worded public statements, no attempt to shape the narrative that others were eager to construct. The real story was unfolding where it always does when something matters, in the invisible shifts of thought, posture, and instinct. Keanu noticed it first in the smallest interactions. In conversations where he once might have listened patiently, while something meaningful went unsaid, he now found himself gently articulating what he felt rather than assuming it could be inferred. He became aware of how often he had historically chosen endurance over expression, believing that strength lived in how much one could carry quietly. The meeting with Sandra had dismantled that belief without attacking it. It had shown him that carrying silently is not the same as carrying wisely. He began to recognize the subtle ways silence had shaped his relationships, sometimes creating space for admiration, sometimes for misunderstanding, often for stories others wrote in the absence of clarity. Now he chose presence more consciously, not loudness, not explanation, presence. He discovered that offering his truth did not burden others, it anchored them. The change was not performative. It did not manifest in speeches or declarations. It appeared in the way he responded when someone asked how he was doing, in the way he acknowledged moments of uncertainty instead of deflecting them, in the way he allowed himself to say when something mattered. Alexandra Grant noticed this shift not as something new, but as something uncovered. She had always known the depth he carried, the thoughtfulness that guided his choices, the gentleness that shaped his interactions. What she saw now was not transformation, but alignment. The quiet understanding between them deepened, not because of what had been discussed about the past, but because of how honestly the present was now lived. She saw how confronting what had once been unresolved had not pulled him backward, but had rooted him more firmly where he stood. Sandra experienced her own evolution, equally subtle and equally profound. In the days following the meeting, she found herself reflecting not on what had been lost, but on what had been clarified. The past no longer appeared to her as a lingering question or an unresolved emotional space. It existed as a completed chapter whose meaning had finally been understood. That understanding freed her from a quiet self-interrogation she had not realized was still operating beneath the surface. She no longer wondered whether she had misread the connection they once shared. She no longer questioned whether she had expected too much or misunderstood too deeply. She saw now that what had been between them had been real, and that its ending had been shaped not by absence of regard, but by the limitations of two people navigating their own internal landscapes. This clarity recalibrated how she carried herself in ways even she did not immediately name. She spoke more directly when something mattered. She allowed herself to ask questions rather than silently resolve them alone. She noticed when she had been praised for strength in ways that subtly discouraged vulnerability, and she consciously resisted that framing. Strength, she realized, was not the ability to remain unaffected. It was the willingness to engage honestly. Her interactions felt lighter, not because they were less meaningful, but because they were no longer weighed down by assumptions. The quiet justice of understanding had restored something essential, her trust in her own perception. Public curiosity, of course, did not fade immediately. The world continued to frame their televised exchange as something dramatic, something nostalgic, something suggestive. Stories were written, opinions were shared, meanings were assigned, yet none of it reached the places where the real consequences were unfolding. Those consequences lived in internal choices, in recalibrated instincts, in conversations that now happened earlier rather than later. Keanu and Sandra did not feel compelled to correct interpretations because they no longer lived inside them. What had been restored was not a relationship, but dignity. And dignity, once reclaimed, does not require defense. Keanu found himself reflecting more broadly on the idea of responsibility, not as something imposed from outside, but as a personal ethic. For years, he had understood responsibility as restraint, as minimizing the impact of his own inner life on others. Now he understood it differently. Responsibility meant offering truth while there was still time for it to serve rather than harm. It meant trusting that people deserve clarity even when clarity feels risky. This shift altered how he viewed kindness. Kindness was no longer only about gentleness. It was about courage. It was about believing that respect sometimes requires saying what is difficult with care rather than leaving others to interpret silence. Sandra's reflections followed a parallel arc. She recognized how often independence had been presented to her as immunity, as if the ability to stand alone negated the human need for mutual understanding. She saw now how that narrative had allowed certain questions to go unasked, certain feelings to go unspoken, not because they were unimportant, but because she had learned how to carry them quietly. The meeting had not made her dependent. It had made her whole. It had affirmed that seeking clarity is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of self-respect. And in reclaiming that, she felt more grounded in her own story than she had in years. Alexandra's role in this chapter remained quiet but foundational. She did not appear in headlines. She did not comment publicly. She did not shape the narrative. She simply continued to be present in the way that had always defined her connection with Keanu, with attentiveness, patience, and an unthreatened openness to truth. She understood that growth does not erase what came before it. It integrates it. In supporting Keanu's willingness to face something unresolved, she reinforced a principle that resonated far beyond their own lives, that healthy relationships are not built on avoiding the past, but on allowing it to be understood. Her presence demonstrated that accountability strengthens connection rather than undermining it. As the weeks became months, the intensity of external attention softened, replaced by something more enduring. Conversations Keanu and Sandra participated in publicly became more thoughtful, less shaped by performance, more reflective of lived experience. When asked about kindness, resilience, or growth, both spoke from a place that was palpably grounded. They emphasized communication. They emphasized presence. They emphasized the importance of not allowing good intentions to substitute for clarity. Their words resonated because they were not presented as lessons. They were shared as realizations. True resolution of this chapter, however, did not appear in any visible marker. It revealed itself quietly in moments unseen by anyone but themselves. It appeared when Keanu chose to speak rather than retreat. It appeared when Sandra trusted her perception without questioning her worth. It manifested in the way both approached relationships with less fear and more dialogue. This was justice not as spectacle but as restoration. A balance returned, a lesson learned, a cycle gently completed. They did not rewrite their history. They honored it. They allowed it to become a source of wisdom rather than ambiguity, and in doing so they demonstrated something rarely celebrated and deeply needed. That even years later, respect can be restored, misunderstandings can be clarified, dignity can be returned without anyone being diminished. The quiet consequences of truth had reshaped them not by adding something new, but by removing something heavy. And in that lightness, both found what they had unknowingly been seeking, not a second chance, but peace. As the months unfolded, the true significance of what Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock had shared did not announce itself through any visible turning point. There was no single moment one could point to and say, "This is where everything changed." Instead, the change revealed itself the way deep things often do, quietly, through the accumulation of small internal decisions that gradually reshape the way a person inhabits their own life. The meeting they had held without an audience, the words they had finally given one another, and the understanding that had emerged did not close a door so much as they widened a horizon. Each of them continued forward into new projects, new conversations, and new seasons of life, yet they did so with a perceptible difference in how they listened, how they spoke, and how they allowed meaning to form between themselves and others. What had once lived as an unresolved space in the background of their story had now become a source of discernment, subtly informing the way they approached connection. Keanu found that healing did not remove complexity from his inner world, but it reordered it. The griefs he had carried for years, the losses that had shaped his instinct to withdraw, and the quiet responsibility he had long assumed for protecting others from his internal weight were still part of him. But they no longer governed him in the same way. Clarity he had reached with Sandra had shown him that self-containment, while often necessary, becomes limiting when it prevents relationship from becoming reciprocal. He began to notice when he felt the impulse to make himself smaller, to absorb rather than express, to disappear gently from moments that asked for presence. And in those moments, he chose differently, not by abandoning his nature, but by expanding it. He discovered that openness did not require him to become someone else. It simply required him to trust that the people he cared about were capable of meeting him where he truly stood. This trust reshaped his relationships in ways that were subtle yet far-reaching. Conversations grew more mutual. Moments of uncertainty were no longer carried privately but shared thoughtfully. He allowed himself to be known not only as someone steady, but as someone human. Alexandra Grant felt this evolution not as a shift away from her, but as a deepening toward her. Their connection grew richer, not because the past had been revisited, but because the present was now inhabited with greater integrity. She saw how the act of facing something unresolved had not fragmented him. It had integrated him. It had allowed the gentleness that defined him to be accompanied by a quiet strength that came not from endurance, but from honesty. Sandra experienced her own transformation, equally inward and equally consequential. What healing left behind for her was not nostalgia or longing, but a restored relationship with her own narrative. She no longer revisited that chapter of her life as something ambiguous or incomplete. It had become a coherent story, one shaped by sincerity, limitation, and growth rather than by absence. This coherence changed the way she related to her memories. They no longer demanded interpretation. They simply existed, understood, and honored. In that understanding, she found a steadiness that did not depend on reassurance from others, but flowed from alignment within herself. This alignment expressed itself in how she approached new connections. She found herself less inclined to quietly manage uncertainty and more inclined to engage it openly. She trusted that asking for clarity was not an imposition, but an invitation to authenticity. She noticed how often people, particularly those who are perceived as strong, are expected to require little emotional context, and she gently resisted that assumption. She allowed herself to articulate needs without apology and boundaries without withdrawal. The past no longer hovered as a reference point. It had become a teacher, informing her choices without dictating them. The public, as ever, continued to observe from a distance, often mistaking silence for secrecy and restraint for narrative design. But neither Keanu nor Sandra felt compelled to participate in that framing. What mattered had already happened where cameras could not reach. The justice of their story was not found in dramatic reversal or public reconciliation. It was found in restoration of dignity, in the return of clarity, in the internal equilibrium that allowed both of them to move forward without carrying each other's unanswered questions. This kind of justice rarely trends. It does not lend itself easily to spectacle, yet it is the kind that changes lives. Keanu reflected often on how differently he now understood courage. He had once believed courage was visible, demonstrated through action, through persistence, through endurance. He now recognized a quieter form of it, the courage to speak while still uncertain, to offer truth without knowing how it will be received, to remain present in conversations that cannot be controlled. He saw how easily people substitute composure for honesty and how costly that substitution can become over time. The experience with Sandra had shown him that the most meaningful courage is not about resolving conflict. It is about preventing misunderstanding from becoming the architecture of a relationship. Sandra's reflections mirrored this understanding. She realized that resilience is often praised as the ability to move forward unaffected, but rarely acknowledged as the willingness to confront what has been carried. She saw now that strength and softness are not opposites. They are companions, and that healing is not an event that erases the past, but a process that reclaims its meaning. In reclaiming that meaning, she had reclaimed a deeper confidence, one not rooted in independence alone, but in discernment, the ability to understand what something was and what it was not. Alexandra continued to embody a truth that quietly anchored this chapter, that healthy relationships are not threatened by honesty about what came before them. They are enriched by it. Her steady presence reinforced the understanding that accountability does not fragment love, it fortifies it. In supporting Keanu's willingness to face something unresolved, she had affirmed a principle that extended beyond any single story, that integration is the work of maturity, and that the past does not disappear when ignored. It transforms only when understood. As time moved forward, the emotional intensity of those earlier months gave way to something gentler and more durable. Keanu and Sandra did not become frequent figures in each other's lives, nor did they retreat into distance. They occupied a space defined not by nostalgia, but by mutual respect. When their paths crossed, there was ease rather than tension, acknowledgement rather than avoidance. Their story no longer required resolution because it had found coherence. And coherence, unlike closure, does not shut a door. It simply allows one to walk away without looking back. What healing had left behind was not a new beginning, but a new way of continuing. It had returned to both of them the ability to move through their lives without the subtle distortion of something unnamed. It had restored to their past its rightful place as a chapter rather than a question. And in doing so, it had offered a lesson that extended quietly beyond them, that the most powerful transformations often leave no visible trace. They leave discernment. They leave presence. They leave the capacity to meet others with clarity rather than assumption. They did not find each other again. They found themselves more fully, and that perhaps was the deeper reconciliation. Time has a way of revealing what truly lasts, not through grand events or dramatic turning points, but through the quiet continuity of days lived without internal resistance. In the final season of what had begun as a moment of confrontation and evolved into a journey of understanding, Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock discovered that peace does not announce itself. It settles. It moves in slowly, almost unnoticed, until one day a person realizes they are no longer carrying something that once shaped every emotional posture. Months after their meeting, after the letters, after the conversations that had reshaped meaning rather than rewriting history, both found themselves inhabiting their lives with a different internal rhythm. There was no longer a background tension tied to an unanswered past. The silence that remained was not avoidance. It was ease. Keanu felt this peace most clearly not in reflection, but in presence. He noticed it in ordinary moments, in conversations that no longer felt asymmetrical, in the way he no longer instinctively stepped back from emotional spaces that asked for him. The instinct to protect through disappearance had softened into a willingness to protect through participation. He still moved through the world with the same gentleness, the same attentiveness that had always defined him, but now it was accompanied by a quiet courage that did not need to be summoned. It was simply there. When something mattered, he said so. When something was uncertain, he allowed it to be discussed rather than endured. The internal justice he had reached did not make him louder. It made him truer. In the life he shared with Alexandra Grant, this truth found its natural expression. Their connection, already grounded in mutual respect and creative companionship, deepened in a way that did not depend on novelty but on alignment. She saw in him not a man changed by a single event, but a man who had chosen integration over compartmentalization. He was no longer someone who quietly carried history. He was someone who had made peace with it. And in that peace, their relationship grew lighter, more reciprocal, more fully inhabited. She understood that the past he had faced had not intruded upon their present. It had strengthened it by removing what was unspoken. Together, they lived within a shared understanding that maturity is not the absence of complexity, but the ability to hold it without distortion. Sandra experienced her peace differently, but no less deeply. For her, it appeared in the way memory no longer demanded resolution. She could think of that chapter of her life without searching it for meaning. It had meaning. It had context. It had boundaries. It existed as part of her story without shaping her present emotional weather. She found that her confidence now rested not in how well she functioned independently, but in how honestly she engaged. She no longer equated self-sufficiency with emotional silence. She no longer interpreted uncertainty as something to be privately managed. Her peace lived in discernment, in the quiet assurance that she understood what had been, and that understanding had freed her from revisiting it. This peace did not isolate her. It expanded her. She found herself mentoring more intentionally, speaking more openly, encouraging clarity in spaces where people often default to politeness. She understood now how many relationships quietly erode not through conflict, but through the accumulation of assumptions. Her own experience had taught her that respect without communication becomes distance, and kindness without courage becomes confusion. In living differently, she honored not only her own story, but the countless unseen stories that mirror it. Their paths crossed occasionally, without ceremony, without the charged awareness that had once accompanied the thought. When they did, there was warmth without history's weight, acknowledgement without unfinished narrative. They spoke easily, not as people revisiting what was, but as people who had allowed what was to become what it needed to be. The story no longer belonged to speculation. It belonged to them, complete and quietly held. What their journey ultimately revealed was not a reunion, not a reversal, not a dramatic transformation. It revealed something rarer, the dignity of resolution without spectacle, the the restoration of balance without public accounting, the courage of accountability without self-condemnation. They demonstrated that justice does not always arrive as confrontation. Sometimes it arrives as clarity. Sometimes it arrives as the return of self-trust. Sometimes it arrives simply as the absence of what once quietly burdened the heart. Keanu often reflected on how many years he had believed that endurance was the highest form of strength. Now he understood that endurance is only one form of it. Another is articulation. Another is presence. Another is the willingness to be known. The moment on stage had not changed him. It had revealed him to himself. It had given him language for instincts he no longer needed to follow. And in choosing differently, he had discovered that the gentlest people are often the ones who must most consciously practice courage. Sandra reflected on how long she had lived comfortably within the world's admiration for composure. She now recognized that composure without clarity can become a quiet prison. The understanding she had gained did not diminish her independence. It completed it. She did not need less of herself. She needed more honesty from the spaces she occupied. And in reclaiming that expectation, she reclaimed an aspect of dignity that had never been lost, only unspoken. Alexandra's presence throughout this final chapter remained a reminder that the healthiest connections are not those untouched by history, but those that can include it without fear. She embodied the truth that love does not compete with the past. It stands on the understanding of it. Her quiet confidence, her respect for complexity, and her unwavering support had created the emotional environment in which this entire journey could resolve without fracture. In that sense, she was not part of the past's story. She was part of its healing. The world eventually moved on, as it always does. New narratives captured attention. New stories filled space. Yet the essence of what had unfolded did not fade. It lived on in choices, in conversations, in the quiet courage of people who, having seen something named honestly, felt permission to name their own. That is how real stories endure, not as events but as influence. In the end, Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock did not rewrite their history. They honored it. They allowed it to become wisdom rather than weight. They showed that even years later, understanding can still arrive. That accountability does not require punishment. That closure does not require reunion. And that peace, the truest form of it, does not need an audience. They did not find a second chance. They found something more enduring. They found peace.